So before we dive in, I'd also love to know who's joining us today. So in the chat, please introduce yourself, where you're joining us from, and what makes you interested in native gardening. And I would also like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today from across the traditional territories of Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I would like to acknowledge the role of our Indigenous stewards of this land and thank them for their teachings. With that, I'll hand things over to Emily for a brief.
Awesome. Thank you, Vicky. So there's just a couple housekeeping things I just want to cover just before we dive into the workshop today. So as you've seen, this workshop was made available for free. We really enjoyed being able to do that. This is one of the webinars we've been wanting to offer for free for a while, so we just decided to do that this year. However, we would greatly appreciate if you would like to donate to our initiative in order to make things like this webinar free, or at least at a much lower cost than our previous webinars. So the OIPC is actually a chapter of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, which is a registered charity, and all donations received are eligible for a tax receipt. So there is a QR code on screen that you can scan with your phone that'll bring you to that donation link. I'm also going to post that in the chat in a second. Once you get to this page, you'll be able to select OIPC from the drop-down menu there, and then you can go ahead and either donate directly via PayPal or debit or credit. I'm just going to real quick stick that link in the chat here. Just give me 1 minute. All right. And there's that link in the chat. Obviously, no pressure to donate, but we just do appreciate if that's something that you would like to do. We encourage you to do that throughout the webinar. You can go to the next slide, Vicky. So recently, we're excited to announce that we've also gotten our webinar series approved for some continuing education credits under the International Society for Arboriculture. It's eligible for 1.25 ISA credits. This is only eligible for the live version of the webinar, which is happening now. The recorded version is not eligible for these. I'm going to put a link in the chat for some information. You'll just have to fill out your name, email, and your ISA certification number. This information will be submitted to ISA in order for you to be able to receive those continuing education credits. So I'll put that into the chat as well. All right, that link is there. It's just to a Google Doc. You'll be able to put that information in for us. And then I will be submitting that information to ISA so you can claim those continuing education credits. Next slide, Vicky. And the last thing I want to just quickly touch here is our upcoming webinars. You'll see that we have the dates and times on the screen here, as well as a little description. So we will be doing an intro to invasive plants. This is the one that we typically do every year, geared towards summer students. Then we'll have one on aquatic invasives, woody invasives, and we're really excited to announce a new webinar that we've never done before, which is on emerging invasive pests in Ontario. I do encourage you to subscribe to our email list or follow us on social media, as the details for registration will become available soon. It is likely that these webinars will have a small cost associated with them, but it will be much lower than our webinars in the past. And I think that that's all the housekeeping stuff I have. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Vicky. If you are having any tech issues or anything, please feel free to message me directly and we'll see if we can get that sorted for you.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. Okay, just get it. There we go. Okay, so before we get started, I also want to just quickly introduce the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So we're a non-for-profit organization working in partnership with professionals and community members throughout Ontario. Our mandate is to provide a coordinated response to the growing threat of invasive plants, and we provide leadership, expertise, and a forum to engage and empower Ontarians to take action on invasive plant issues. And we're also a chapter of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, working to address the impacts of invasive species. So we have a diverse board of directors, including representatives from federal and provincial governments, municipalities, conservation authorities, agriculture, industry, and non-government. So this network provides a valuable forum for coordinated action. And we're probably best known for our best management practice guides and technical bulletins that are available for free download on our website. These guides provide a comprehensive overview on individual invasive species. So if you're looking for advice on how to control a specific plant, you can go to our website and download our resources. And one of our most popular guides by far has been the Grow Me Instead guide and the Grow Me Instead program. So just to provide a quick background, the Grow Me Instead program was initiated by the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative, which is a committee of the OIPC. It was formed in 2010 by representatives from NGOs, academic institutes, green industries, and government agencies in Ontario who were really passionate about this topic and decided to form a committee focused on the horticultural pathway of spread. So in 2011, they first launched the Grow Me Instead guide that provides advice on common garden plants with invasive tendencies and provides alternative species that are non-invasive. So there's a Southern Grow Me Instead guide for Southern Ontario, a French version of that Southern guide, and a Northern version as well. And so the guides, both the Northern and Southern, have several sections on grasses, wildflowers, and ground covers, vines, trees and shrubs, and aquatics. So it's divided into several sections. And then within each section, there's a photo and a description of an invasive horticulture species and then alternatives to plant instead. The alternatives were chosen based on their proven ability to be non-invasive or native, whether they were easily found in horticulture or more widespread, more available on the market, and whether they had similar requirements as a potential invasive species. So not every alternative listed is native to Ontario per se. It wasn't always possible to pair a native species with the same growing requirements as an invasive. So where necessary, a non-invasive alternative was chosen. And so the Southern Grow Me Instead guide includes 28 invasives and 76 alternatives. The Southern Guide has gone through several editions from 2011. So 2020 is the most recent edition, and we're planning on an update starting this year. So looking forward to providing some updates there. And so let's begin by definition of what is considered a native species. So a species, it's considered a species that has existed in an area prior to European settlement. So generally that's considered to be the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. So it's kind of a cutoff date. If the species was present in Ontario before that cutoff of 1492 European settlement, then it's considered native. Native plants are beneficial because they've evolved in the presence of native soils and climate and in tandem with other native species of plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. Native plants support a greater diversity of wildlife than invasive or just ones that species that haven't evolved in that whole climate for thousands of years. And an invasive species is a species that has been introduced from another geographic region and into an area outside its natural range, and it has negative impacts to the environment, economy, and society. So there's a whole spectrum. So not every introduced species is necessarily going to be invasive. It could start with an exotic. So for example, planting a Cavendish banana plant in your garden, it will grow for the period of time in the summer and then die because it can't survive our temperate climate. So that would just be considered sort of almost like a plastic plant. Like it looks nice and then it dies. It's not invasive. It can't survive our climate. And then you have naturalized species. For example, dandelion's a good example of one that does escape into our natural areas, but there's no net positive or negative to that species. And then you have the whole spectrum of invasive. So starting from minimally invasive, so competing with some natives, to becoming more locally dominant in certain areas, to being a whole ecosystem transformer. So dominating niches, excluding native plants. Phragmites, garlic mustard, dog string vine are all good examples of ecosystem transformers. And also important to note that it all depends on the area. Like Ontario has a lot of local geographic kind of microclimates. So what can be invasive in one area might not be as invasive in another. Invasive plants have many traits that make them successful. So they're highly adaptable, able to tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions or poor soils, urban pollution. They have few predators, so oftentimes nothing has evolved in that area in the new geographic range. So there's no predators. They have often the ability to reproduce quickly. So there's high seed production, high seed viability, and very competitive, especially compared to native plants. So for example, being able to begin growing early in the season and then stop growing late in the season. There's many invasive species that have a lot of competitive advantages. So it matters because invasive species are the second most significant cause of species extinction worldwide after habitat loss. So it's basically seen as like a secondary habitat loss. And in Ontario, we have the most invasive species compared to other provinces, based mainly on our location, and we're always at risk for more invasions based on our location. Invasive species have many ecological impacts. For example, Phragmites, when it takes over wetlands, it makes the quality nesting habitats for turtles like Blanding's turtle much reduced. So they often don't have the ideal habitat anymore for nesting, or they get caught in between the reeds, or they become isolated from the thick reeds from accessing other parts of the wetland. And then garlic mustard in the spring threatens our beautiful native wildflower displays like the trillium. For example, you will often see invaded forests in the spring where you just have a monoculture of garlic mustard and nothing else. And then there's socioeconomic impacts from phragmites, for example, impacting the recreational aesthetics of a shoreline, or buckthorn. It can be a host to agricultural pests like oak crown rust, and Japanese knotweed, for example, which can grow through asphalt. So it can impact infrastructure. And then health and safety. So you can have Phragmites blocking road signs, causing a safety risk on roads, or many of you are familiar with giant hogweed, causing a toxic photodermatitis rash if you're exposed to the sap and then you're in the sun. So pathways of spread, there's both natural and man-made. Man-made pathways are the main ways for long distance spread. So example, through roads, which is a common way Phragmites spreads, for example, or horticulture, which we'll get to in a minute. Recreational boating or other equipment where seeds lodge on to different parts of the equipment. Fire and wood movement is a really important pathway for our forest pests to spread. And in terms of horticulture, the horticulture and nursery trades are one of the primary pathways for invasive species introductions and responsible for 31% of all invasions globally. 85% of all non-native woody plants in North America were introduced through the landscape trade. And while most horticulture plants are harmless garden additions, some can escape cultivation and become problematic. So one way of the ways we can all get involved and reduce the spread of invasive species is to plant native. And by planting native species in your garden, you can play a huge role in promoting pollinator habitat and in turn supporting local populations of insects and wildlife. So I really love this quote: if something's not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. So it's that shift in mindset of seeing your place where you live as an ecosystem that you're part of, rather than isolated and, just having a lawn or a few plants that, look nice, but don't necessarily offer anything to the environment. So I'll begin by covering ground covers. There are many invasive ground covers, so that's a good place to start. So many of you might be familiar with English ivy. English ivy essentially has no natural predators in North America. It's a very hardy plant with low maintenance, which is one of the reasons it's become so invasive. And I just have an example here of a ravine close to my house where garden waste is typically dumped, and there's a whole area of monoculture of English ivy. So some alternatives to consider, one is wild ginger. So this is a perennial ground cover for shade to partial sun areas. In the wild, it's commonly found on gentle woodland slopes. It tends to form clumps and spread by rhizomes, so it can spread quite nicely over a couple years. It blooms in the spring and has these interesting maroon flowers, and they give off a scent that attracts flies. It's said to smell like animal carrion carcass to them, so they're attracted to that smell. And the leaves are quite attractive too. They're heart-shaped leaves, a little furry on the bottom, and they keep well throughout the season. And then there's wild strawberry or Virginia strawberry. This is a low-growing perennial that spreads quickly with runners. It's a great ground cover for sunny gardens and does well in full sun and dry to average soil. So if you are looking to plant strawberry in a more shady spot, there's also the native woodland strawberry, Fragaria vesca, that does well in moderate shade and soil. So it has the 5-petaled flowers that attract many pollinators. And then later in the season, it gives way to these delicious small berries that are very attractive to birds. And another invasive is goutweed, which you're probably familiar with. This species can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions and is highly shade tolerant. It spreads through rhizomes. It's very competitive and an aggressive invader. This picture here is showing the variegated form of goutweed, but there's also other forms like a pure green form. And I just wanted to say we have a BMP on goutweed if you're looking for advice on how to control this one. And I thought I'd just throw in a picture of an invaded area, natural area just by my house of goutweed. So this is all just the green variety of goutweed, all in here. So an alternative to that is Virginia waterleaf. This is a really great option for shady gardens. It spreads via rhizomes quite aggressively. So I say aggressive, like some native plants really are aggressive as well in terms of how they can spread. And this is a good one if you're looking for a spot where you've removed an invasive like garlic mustard or goutweed and you want a native species to really fill in quickly. It has these attractive purple flowers with these elongated stamens in the spring, and they attract bumblebees and other pollinators. And then one thing that's interesting about the species is it often has these splotches on the leaves that are said to look like water on leaves, little water drops. And there's some research from the University of Toronto that this modeling helps it to reduce herbivore damage. Some other invaders that are almost like plastic plants that offer not a lot to the environment are lily of the valley and periwinkle. So lily of the valley spreads vegetatively via rhizomes. It does have very pretty flowers, but unfortunately can spread very quickly. Periwinkle is a great ground cover that can withstand even highly urban polluted environments. But unfortunately, it can spread quickly as well with runners. An alternative to those species is wild geranium. So this is a great ground cover alternative, especially for shaded woodland gardens. It has pink-purple flowers in the summer that attract honeybees, bumblebees, and many types of native solitary bees. And now we'll get into some wildflowers. So this is probably a familiar sight to many of you in in the summer, towards the mid to end of July, is when orange ditch lily or daylily blooms. It's often found along roadsides and road ditches across the province. The flowers are showy orange with some striping, and they're large and quite showy. The leaves are linear and long, and it forms these dense patches and spreads through tuberous roots and through seeds. So many are surprised that this species is invasive, but it's also important to note that there are other horticulture daylily species that are not invasive. And there's a few native lookalikes as well. There's Michigan lily, which is a great alternative to plant, and wood lily. That's a native species found further north. So some alternative wildflowers, the next two I'll mention are really easy to grow and maintain, especially in sunny areas. So if you're looking for alternatives in prairie or meadow gardens, these are great additions. So black-eyed Susan, they're resilient wildflowers that grow well in disturbed or unfavorable environments, and the yellow flowers bloom biennially, so every other year. It reseeds quickly, so flowers are often seen every year. And the flowers attract many insects, such as bees, butterflies, and birds that eat the birds mainly eat the seeds. And it also grows well with other meadow species, such as purple coneflower, wild bergamot, asters, or prairie grasses like Indian grass. So this is another species. Pale purple coneflower, or echinacea, is a nice complement with black-eyed Susan. It also grows well. It's also hardy and drought resistant. It's a tall ground cover. It can be found in shades of purple or white, depending on the cultivar. It attracts monarch butterflies, and its large seed heads attract birds. It is listed as non-native in our area, but it's sort of a borderline near native species, and it's often chosen in a lot of restoration plantings. Next are grasses. So you're probably also familiar with miscanthus grasses, which are a very popular common garden plant. Miscanthus has been often labeled as the next Phragmites because, like Phragmites, it spreads aggressively and displaces native species. It's also a fire hazard like Phragmites when it dries out. It's a frequent sight in gardens and is now found more frequently along roadsides, and you see it sometimes alongside with Phragmites. It's thick, found in thick bunches, and it's fast growing. But it's also important to note that there's a lot of varieties of miscanthus, and not all varieties are invasive. Some are actually hard to grow, although they don't offer too much ecosystem-wise. And then if you do have the space, an alternative to consider is big blue stem. This is a tall grass that gets up to 7 feet with deep roots, and it's great for erosion control. It's great for prairie and meadow gardens intermixed with other wildflower species. Because of its height, songbirds find shelter and food within this grass. The seed pods are blue-green in spring, and then they turn a rich orange, coppery red in the fall. So they're quite attractive if you have the space for them. And then there's Indian grass, which is another good one if you have the space. It's a tall grass for prairie and meadow gardens. In the fall, the foliage turns yellow to bright orange with rich gold purple sprays of flowers and seeds. So it's an attractive fall color in your garden. The grass spreads rapidly with rhizomes, so it's not ideal for small areas. And caterpillars and grasshoppers that eat the grass blades then become a food source for birds. So it's a good choice. And then here is an example of a sedge I wanted to throw in. Ivory sedge is a great low-growing, low-maintenance alternative for rock gardens with thin soils. It's a good long alternative or ground cover, and it's adaptable to heat and drought. It tolerates grazing, deer grazing very well, and heavy shade. And then I'll move into trees. So one common invasive tree is the Norway maple. So this is a familiar sight in urban centers across Ontario. It was once planted widely in cities and towns after World War II as a replacement for white elms that were decimated by Dutch elm disease. It has many desirable characteristics as an urban street tree, like being able to withstand pollution and compacted soils, but it can escape natural areas, and over decades, it can drastically alter the composition of our forests. It has no positive relationships with pollinators and native animals, so it's essentially a plastic tree. Many municipalities are now aware of how invasive Norway maple can be and no longer have it on their tree planting lists. However, there are many cultivars and alternate names for Norway maple that are sold in nurseries. So this is one of those tricky ones where it's still may not be labeled Norway maple in a nursery, but it's still being sold. So there's one variety, Crimson King, that's very common. It has rich maroon leaves, and it has been mistaken for red maple, an unrelated native species. And one of the hallmarks sort of IDing Norway maple is the milky latex sap that exudes from the leaf petiole if you break it. And other native species like sugar don't do that. It's just clear sap. So some native maples are great alternatives to consider for planting, such as sugar, silver, or Freeman or red maple. They're well adapted to our climate in Ontario and require less maintenance, but it's also important to consider your site and the species suitability for growing. So like sugar maple doesn't do as well in urban soils, and silver maple has an aggressive root system, so it's not good to plant near pipes and foundations. So it's good to do some research and look into your site and what's appropriate for growing at your site. But if you can grow it, these are really great options. An invasive shrub species to mention is winged euonymus. It's also known as burning bush. This is a very common sight throughout Ontario as well, in residential neighborhoods in the fall when the leaf foliage turns this sort of brilliant red color. It's a woody multi-stem deciduous shrub, and many are surprised to learn that it's invasive because it doesn't appear to spread very much in someone's front lawn, for example. But birds feed on the seeds. They're a great winter food. They are a winter food source for birds. And then the birds disperse them into natural areas. So here's a natural area in Ontario where winged euonymus has escaped. And you can see it has more of a pale pink to yellowish pink color to it. So it can be easily missed, but it does escape into our natural areas and is highly competitive and displaces native species. So a great alternative is fragrant sumac. This is a drought-tolerant shrub that easily establishes and requires little maintenance. It can grow quite thick and intertwined and has yellow summer blooms that attract blueberries, bumblebees, and hummingbirds for pollination. The flowers here are clusters of red hairy berries with a sweet lemon scent in the summer. And to show native species can also be quite attractive in the fall. It turns a brilliant orange, red, and purple color. The leaves turn in the fall. And then service berries are also great additions to a native garden. There are several species of native service berries to consider. The berries are sweet and edible, and they turn from a green to red to dark purple throughout the season. And they are much loved by birds. In the spring, they have nice, attractive white flowers. And this is an example here of Amelanchier laevis that has these coppery leaves in the spring. So it's another species that has really brilliant colors of leaves in the spring. So some examples of invasive shrubs include Japanese barberry. This has been very popular, planted as an ornamental. It's adaptable to many soil types, and when it does escape natural areas, it forms dense thickets. It's a really prolific seed producer, high seed viability, so it does really well in natural areas. Russian and autumn olive were often commonly planted for hedgerows. It originated from Asia. It was used because it's hardy and adaptable. It thrives in nutrient-poor soils, so it does well in urban areas, but it can reproduce quickly via suckers, and it can spread rapidly. So an alternative to consider is native bush honeysuckle. So this is an excellent drought-tolerant shrub that establishes easily and requires little maintenance. It's a low-growing shrub that prefers a dry, sandy location and full sun to part shade. And it has these small bell-shaped flowers that attract bumblebees and hummingbirds for pollination. And it's great for providing shelter for wildlife as well. A common ninebark is a fast-growing and hardy shrub that tolerates a range of moisture levels. It has attractive summer flowers and vibrant fall colors. Ninebark is adaptable to harsh soil conditions and is excellent for birds and smaller wildlife. And then we have vines. So two I want to mention are Japanese honeysuckle vines and Oriental bittersweet vines. So both of these are sort of twining vines that twine around supports, and often when they twine around trees, they'll topple them over and eventually kill them. They spread rapidly and they easily outcompete native species for habitat. And Oriental bittersweet was often planted as an attractive ornamental for its orange berries that were used in craft making, wreath making, especially in the fall. But birds eat the seeds. It's often as something, a possible winter food source for birds that feed and then widely spread the species in natural areas. And it's another one that's often overlooked in natural areas because it's quite inconspicuous when it does escape. It's just these kind of green leaves and kind of just blends in with everything else. And a good alternative to consider is Virginia creeper, which is a very common native species. It does spread quite aggressively, so it is actually considered to have some invasive tendencies in terms of how fast it spreads, but it's really a great native to have if you're looking to have an area where you can outcompete some invasive weedy species in your garden. And also it's very tolerant and hardy, and it's a great potential to have that rose up walls, for example, and it does really well. It grows well in sun to full shade and moist soil. It has these dark, bright blue berries that bloom that are produced in early fall, and then the leaves turn vibrant red in the fall. So, and then there's Dutchman's pipe. Dutchman's pipe can be also used as a climbing vine. It has very unique pipe-shaped flowers that are rich in nectar that attract hummingbirds. It grows well in full sun to part shades and moist, well-drained soil, and it's tolerant to a lot of urban conditions. So what are some other things you can do? So I wanted to give a couple other tips. So one of the things is to be more aware of what's in your garden and what's in your area. Learn how to identify species that you commonly encounter. iNaturalist.org is a great place to get advice on how to ID, but there's also many field guides that are really great. And disposal of invasive plants is really key as well. The way we recommend to dispose of invasive plant material that's potentially viable is put them in black garbage bags and then let them bake in the sun. Let those garbage bags bake in the sun for about 7 to 10 days, and just that'll give enough time for the viable parts to decompose and die. So if you just put them in compost, the regular backyard compost never reaches the temperatures required to actually kill seeds or rhizomes. Another really important one is to not dump yard waste into nearby natural areas. So I want to show an example very close to my house where garden waste is commonly dumped, and it's become a ground for many invasive species to spread. So it's, many invasives are now spreading down into the ravine. Also purchase non-invasive or native plants from reputable sources. I have an example. The North American Native Plant Society has a great link to commercial growers, and this is something Claudette will get into a little more in her presentation, so you can find out more. Also, just to say places you can report invasive species sightings, you can go to edmaps.org or go to the invading species hotline that's run by ISAP and report an invasive, or iNaturalist, which is a great citizen science tool. You can visit our website or become a member and download our resources like the Grow Me Instead guides. And with that, I'd love to introduce Claudette Sims. I'll just briefly just do her bio before we introduce her to the stage. So Claudette joined Master Gardeners of Ontario in 2004 and served as president for 6 years. She was a regular panelist and lead on the weekly CBC Radio online garden chat for many years and has subbed in for Ed Lawrence on the radio, a thrilling but scary experience. Claudette is currently the admin for a very successful Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook group and works with a great team of master gardeners and garden experts to provide reliable science-based gardening advice to the public. She and Kathy Cavasalis are the co-founders of the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation, which aims to stop the sale of high-risk invasive plants that harm biodiversity. She loves to attract wildlife to her garden, and her most recent passion is adding larval host butterfly plants and native plants to support pollinators. So welcome, Claudette. I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen here. Just 1 second.
Can you see that now, Vicki?
Yep, now I see.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I really have to, well, thank you both for inviting me and also for all the work that you do with your Grow Me Instead guides and everything, and offering this webinar for free. It's one of the things that SIPR has asked for, that the government, provide this education to people. So well done, you're on the right track. So I'm here to talk about adapting native garden principles from the Grow Me Instead to your garden. This is my front garden, which I'll talk about here and there. Full disclosure, I wanted to make sure that you understood that, just going to minimize, that many of us have had or have invasive plants in their garden. Here's a picture of Niagara Botanical Garden, just taken in April of 2024. But we're not here to blame you or shame you about having invasive plants in your garden. This has happened to many of us. It's really a journey of changing your garden and adapting and learning. So we're all on this journey together, and we're at different places. So as was suggested or mentioned, I give gardening advice to the public on our Master Gardener of Ontario Facebook page, and I'm thrilled to see actually some of our admins that have joined us, and also some of our forum members. So I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting plants, attracting wildlife, native gardening principles, and challenges that appear. I'm always shocked when if we have a question on our forum, someone will say, "What do you mean this is invasive?" It's a plant they've just bought. So really SIPR, the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulation, is really aimed at stopping the sale of invasive plants in horticulture. I think we should reflect on why all this is a problem. We are currently in an insect apocalypse. Insects have declined by 45% globally in the last 35 years. Flying insects are down an incredible 70%. This has happened in my lifetime. When I was young, I remember, light bulbs that were haloed with flying insects, grasshoppers in my garden when I walked in it. When you went for a drive, there were insects on your windshield wiper and on your bumper. You could hear insects in your garden at night. A lot of this is no longer happening in many of your gardens. But what I hear from native plant gardeners is that as they trend to invasive plants and make those changes, that's what you see in your garden. You hear the insects. I have the fireflies in my gardens. My garden is now alive. So I encourage everyone to start this journey of adding invasive plants. E.O. Wilson, who was a Harvard biologist and a Pulitzer Prize winner, said that insects are the little things that run the world. So they are essential both to our ecosystems and to human health. The decline of insects is also a driver for the loss of North American birds. We have lost an incredible almost 3 billion, not million, but billion birds since 1970. Again, this has happened in my lifetime. And invasive plants are one of the drivers. So we know that invasive plants tend to be bullies in the garden. They exclude native plants. And also, they tend to be hosts for invasive pests, such as the spotted lanternfly and the marmorated stink bug. They also, when they are shrubs and have berries or other resources, they tend to be not as nutritious for both our native birds and also our native insects. While non-native plants might not do any harm, they don't support ecosystem function as well as native plants. They certainly will support non-native insects such as European honeybees and starlings, and they also support generalist species, and there are some generalist bees. But we need to look to native plants to do that. If you're starting your journey to adding native plants, you might have stumbled upon cultivars. But again, all of these are not created equal. Something like the Annabelle hydrangea, which started off as a native hydrangea, the flowers were changed to make them larger, but they are now all sterile. And this is something that I'm seeing more and more with cultivars of plants. Large sunflowers are sometimes bred to be sterile because you don't want to have a bride with a bouquet and having pollen all over. So there's no pollen for our native bees. Then the other big change that is a concern is when you change the color of a leaf. Early on, I did add this Diablo 9-bark to my garden, thinking it was beautiful and added lovely color. But I now know that when you alter the leaf color of a plant, you alter the chemistry of a plant, which then might make it unpalatable to native insects. So really, if you can, try and choose native plants, and I'll talk a little bit more about keystone plants, which are sort of the superstars of native plants, and they support far more species. This image is very typical of gardens in my suburban area. The plants are really, they're chosen for their appearance. The country of origin is rarely considered. They are often planted individually as an accent. They almost remind me of throw pillows on a couch. So they're not really treated as living things, but they're treated as ornamental. And this is where you see mulch almost used as a garden feature, which is a strange thing in itself. There's often, these plants are chosen with no common soil or moisture preferences. And the cultural practices also follow what appearance. So we trim hedges to be in spherical shapes, or we remove all the leaves and the stems from a garden. So these cultural practices actually harm biodiversity. Then these types of gardens tend to have significant resource inputs such as water, pesticide use, and fertilizer. In contrast, when you garden with native plants, you're looking at a community of plants. They're chosen for their ecosystem functions. So this is my front yard, which, by the way, is kind of crazy looking, but it gets rave reviews from children and young families. And actually, I've only had positive reviews from people. So I choose these plants for their pollen, nectar, foliar, and fruit resources, and for their seeds. I choose ones that support native bees, insects, animals, and birds. I am currently enthralled with host plants for moths and butterflies, which in turn will support our native birds, pardon me, which are suffering. This type of garden uses minimum resource inputs. I don't put any fertilizer on this, and I water it very little, but it does need wet maintenance. You have to weed it just like any garden. And I do find that the native goldenrod, the common Canada goldenrod, tends to take over, but I either weed it or I'll give it a Chelsea chop in June or July, and then it gives me like a beautiful shrubby appearance. And I actually quite like it. It's not for everybody, but it's one that I adore. And there are a lot of native plants that tend to be taller in a garden, so that Chelsea chop in June or July does give it a shrubbier appearance. I want to make clear that when I'm talking about native bees throughout this presentation, I'm not talking about native honeybees. They are wonderful creatures. They're just amazing for the things that they can do, but they're basically an agricultural animal that is completely managed by humans. So when we're talking about gardening for bees, it's not about honeybees. Saving honeybees doesn't save wild bees any more than keeping backyard chickens saves wild birds. So when you're choosing plants, look for plants that are native to your region, and if possible, buy them at a native plant nursery at a nursery that is close to your area. Try and avoid going out of your area to buy them. Match plants with your actual growing conditions. Don't try and change your soil conditions. You can garden with clay. Clay is a wonderful soil to garden with. So work with your garden conditions. Include a diversity of species. Prioritize trees and shrubs. They have the most ecosystem impact. Choose perennials that bloom from early spring to late fall, so you have those foliar resources for native bees and butterflies, and also choose ones that have a variety of flower shapes, colors, and sizes. Don't forget native grasses and sedges. They create a matrix in your garden, and they also support lots of native butterflies. If you're adding aggressive native species to your garden, you can either contain them or you can add them after your other native plants are established. And actually, I just read an excellent blog post from Rick Gray, who's one of our forum moderators, I didn't realize, and he talks about containing aggressive species. When you're adding plants, start where you are and then try and get at least 70% native plants by biomass in your garden. And if you can, go beyond that 70% and aim for as many native plants as possible. I want to talk a little bit about the co-evolved functional relationships. I particularly like this definition of native plants by Lorraine Johnson. So I want to focus in on the evolved in association with the features of a place and specific important functional relationships and interactions. So let's take a look at what this means. Thankfully, with the monarch butterfly, we're all familiar with the fact that milkweed is a larval host for this species. This is just one example of how plants evolved in association with each other. But let's think beyond iconic individuals. One of my favorite things to do when I'm giving gardening advice on our Master Gardener forum is to search for whatever plant the person has asked for and the word faunal associations. This will lead you to Illinois wildflowers, and they will give you a long list of animals that are supported. In this case, here are insects that are supported by the nectar, the leaves, the stems, and the seed pods of milkweed. So milkweed will support things like not just monarch butterflies, but the delicate cycnia, the tussock moth. It'll also support beetles such as the red milkweed beetle and the large milkweed beetle. Then it also supports tiny insects such as milkweed galls, which will be within the leaves of a milkweed. And this is a photo from my garden where I see all these aphids. I think they're probably non-native oleander aphids, but you can see, I think the ants are farming them. And then of course the aphids will be food for the native ladybug, which will come and lay her eggs, and the nymphs will get this. For a few years, I've been looking at the stems from my native butterfly milkweed, and I've always been puzzled with them because sometimes I look at them and they're very filamentous, and it's almost as if some other filaments from other areas have blown in, and I see like a nest of them. But what I learned recently watching a video from Rebecca McMacken is that a lot of our native birds will strip the filaments from the milkweed to build their nests. So this is one of the functional relationships that native plants have. But that functional relationship is destroyed if you don't follow good cultural practices. So they really matter. You need to leave the stems and you need to leave the leaves in your garden. If you have a lot of stems that are fallen over, you just take them and I stick them in the garden near a fence or a wall. The evening primrose sweat bee has often been mentioned, and it has a relationship with the evening primrose. The hind legs of this bee are specially designed and have evolved to collect the pollen from this particular plant. So when you garden with non-native plants, you exclude about 25% of bees that are pollen specialists, those bees that have specific and important functional relationships with native plants. Many of you will be familiar with Doug Ptolemy's list of and his research on plants that support native moths and pollinators. With his research team, he has identified plants that support really complex food webs. Some examples of trees are oaks, cherries, willows, maples are also a species. These ones support huge numbers of Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies. That's important because those then support native birds, which are our insectivores. In perennials, you're going to look to goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers as superstars that will support diverse native insect species. These are called keystone plants because, like a keystone in a stone wall, they support really complex food webs and just do more in your garden. Native plant gardening is all about this co-evolved relationship and community. And I want to emphasize that it's not just supporting species above the ground, but also supporting those soil biota. We are just learning more about invasive species and how they change soil chemistry to make it more, to make it better for themselves and to exclude native species. So when you have native plants in your garden, you support those important soil biota, but you also support species which support other species and other species. It's that interconnected nature of life. There are a few challenges with gardening with native species, not a lot, but I'm going to go over a few of them. One of them is plant choices. So you have excellent suggestions in the Grow Me Instead guides. I wanted to point out that Clean North has come out with a salt and algoma Grow Me Instead guide as well. So you can look there if you're living in Northern Ontario. But I think we should also not forget our neighbors to the south. A lot of our US border states are dealing with invasive plants, and they're doing so because, and they have better regulations because, and I think it's because those plants are appearing south of the border for various reasons, and they're on their watch lists. So they've come out with excellent resources. Here's one from the Missouri Prairie Foundation with native aquatic plants. And what I liked was that it had container plants for aquatic plants. Credit Valley Conservation is just a superstar with all the information it gives. This particular resource has rain-ready landscape plants, rain gardens being very popular, and not only supporting biodiversity, but helping ecosystems by stopping water runoff into our sewers and our lakes. Upper Thames Conservation Authority has lists of butterfly plants. I'm often asked, which plants support butterflies, or if I'm giving an alternative plant instead of an invasive plant, if I tell people this is better than that invasive plant, plus you'll be growing butterflies, it's a super selling point for selling native plants. I love the Xerces Society list, and there are all kinds of them for beneficial insects. And here's another selling point for native plants is when people talk about the problem with invasive Japanese beetles in their garden, I will say, well, plant these native plants. They'll keep your garden in balance, and also it'll actually, I don't have any Japanese beetles in my garden, I think because of it. I didn't know Sean Booth was going to be with us today, but In Our Nature is a nursery that has absolutely fabulous and resources. I think Sean is no longer selling plants, but luckily he's left all his wonderful information there. So he has all kinds of different conditions and features, things, boulevard gardens, which are often asked for, and ground covers. He has 6 milkweed, 4 sunflowers, native sunflowers, and tons of goldenrods and asters, which can make your garden beautiful. I love that he has berry producing shrubs for birds and plants for hummingbirds. These are things that people request. Ontario Native Plant Nursery has search filters. It's not the only one, but I love this if I'm having to look for a particular plant. So you can click on sun, dry, clay, shrub, and get plants for your Zone 6 garden. The Forest Gene Conservation Association has an amazing website. You can click on one of these areas and a PDF of plants that are locally native to your area will pop up. This is a real lifesaver. One of the big problems is deciding what is invasive. And while the Grow Me Instead guides have excellent lists of plants, I'm finding that some plants are missing. For instance, we are currently in a a Scilla invasion all over Ontario. We're seeing all kinds of posts of Scilla invading natural lands and invading people's gardens. It's extremely difficult to get rid of. I don't see it on a lot of lists, but the Credit Valley Conservation Authority has it, and they have that invasive list, as Vicki has explained, that goes from minimally invasive or transformers to minimally invasive. So that's really helpful. I think they have over 130 plants. It's a really robust site. The Upper Thames also has a really good list. If you're in that area, you should look to that one. And our Auditor General of Ontario came out with a list of 28 plants which should not be sold or shared in Ontario. So it's a really powerful statement to make when someone says that periwinkle is not invasive. We can say, well, our Auditor General thinks differently. If you want invasive plant lists, I think there's no better place than our SIPR website. If you look under resources and invasive plant lists, it's organized in a number of different fashions, but you'll see Ontario, there's the Auditor General's list, the Credit Valley Conservation list, and many others. Please use those resources freely and share them. I find that the cost of transitioning to native plants can be sometimes a barrier to people. Invasive plants like periwinkle, this one is sold as a flat, and so is Pachysandra, as compared to here's the in our zone plants in a local nursery last year that I saw. The tiny in our zone plants, single plants were sold for I think $7 or $8, where you could get an entire flat of mature Pachysandra for $13. So that becomes an issue. You can grow native plants from seed. It's fairly easily done, but requires patience and some skill. And then you need the native seeds, which also there's a lot of native seed libraries, so that is very doable. I want to emphasize that to have an ecological garden doesn't mean that it's a weedy garden. They don't have to look weedy. Appearance is a function of the design, not of the plants. So take the time to learn about your garden and find suitable plants that match your garden. Add plants in repetition to build unity. Start with trees and shrubs, as I've said. And if you're doing a front yard garden, add a buffer zone here of low growing plants and make sure you check your municipal bylaws. All gardens need maintenance, even native plant gardens, and to look their best, you need to do some maintenance. I wanted to mention that this infographic, along with further instructions, can be found on the Halton Master Gardener site. When you're transitioning from invasive to natives, it can be a bit of a challenge. I had not a mature Norway maple, but a large Norway maple that I watched for several years, and then I finally made the decision that no, I have to remove this plant because it might have some ecosystem functions, but really it was doing some harm to my garden, so I got rid of it. If you have 5 or 6 mature Norway maples, you have to think about how you're going to do that transition. If you remove an invasive plant, you need to replant as soon as possible so that it's not more newly invaded, and you have to monitor for years for reoccurrence. I took out my periwinkle and English ivy maybe 10 years ago. I still see bits of it in my garden. When you have, I think you want to avoid bare spots, so I try and transition things slowly. This is Euonymus fortunii in my garden, and it's growing from here. I have cut it back significantly over the last 2 years. I underplanted it with a climbing hydrangea, and this year the climbing hydrangea has gotten to a good size, so I'm going to further reduce this plant, and eventually it will disappear. So I tend to underplant shrubs under whatever invasive I'm trying to get rid of, or non-native in some cases. ID and mislabeling is a huge problem. As Vicki has mentioned, I've seen red maples labeled, which are not red maples, they're Norway maples. And an hyssop is one that is often mislabeled. There's also the problem of existing plants in your garden. So I have this Solomon seal, and I've been trying for a couple of years to figure out, is it the native or is it the non-native? You actually, I think, have to look at the anthers, which can be, well, it's time consuming, and it can also be a challenge. And then these plants tend to hybridize, so it tends to be difficult to identify them. Another thing is just determining native range. I was editing an article recently where the author had suggested Tiarella cordifolia as an alternative to an invasive plant. So I thought, better check to make sure it is native. So I started with VASCAN, And when I typed that in, it actually said it was excluded, which made me, I was surprised at that. So I just typed in Tiarella, and then it appeared in 4 provinces, which further confused me. That led me to an iNaturalist forum where they were talking about name changes. This was actually a 32-minute read. And sometimes when you're reading forums, people give their opinions and it's not very science-based. And I didn't have 32 minutes, so I thought, I'm going to go to the experts. So I went to this plant name index and it just had so many different links that I got just a little bit discouraged at this point and thought, geez, how can I do this more easily? Now, I didn't know that Rick was going to be here tonight and Sean, or today and Sean, but I picked up my book, their new book that I just got, and I did look at Tiarella, and sure enough, Rick and Sean had put a nice little message saying that Tiarella cordifolia had been changed to Stolonifera, and that many websites and native plant nurseries may still be using the old name. So thank you very much for that. My garden is a haven for me of plants, and I love my plants, but I've got to say that what gives excitement to my garden is when I see these critters in my garden. One of the more recent ones was this photo of a firefly that my daughter took in the middle of the day. It just blew me away. So my garden is alive with fireflies in June and July. It does hum at night, and there are flitting insects everywhere during the day. I absolutely love it. I love all the critters in my garden. Thank you very much for listening. If you can, check out our resources on our coalition website, become a supporter. We don't ask for money, we don't bug you, we don't send you emails. We just want supporters so that we can convince the government that invasive plants should not be sold. Look to Halton Region Master Gardeners and actually your local Master Gardener group as well, and Master Gardeners of Ontario for resources. Halton has a beautiful newsletter, the one that I edit. We always have a feature plant. We sometimes have feature gardeners as well. I think this month in May, we're having an article from Kevin Kavanaugh. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for adding native plants to your garden.
Thank you so much, Claudette. That was an excellent presentation and enjoyed learning it and always learning new things. That was really great. So now we're ready for our Q&A panel and to introduce Rick Gray and Sean Booth, so if they could come on as well. Turn on their camera, mic. Great. I think they're going to briefly mention their recent publication, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
I had no idea Sean and Rick were going to be here today. I'm just thrilled.
Well, this is what it's all about. See if, oh, my camera won't. Yeah.
So great. That's okay. Oh, I see it now.
Yeah, so Sean and I started this about 5-6 years ago, and a couple of years ago was reaching a point where I was doing days and nights working on it. I was starting to get tired and still had some key things to get finished in the book. So I reached out to Sean and I said, would you be interested in helping me finish this? And he said, of course, it's an important book that we need that. And so we spent the next couple of years finishing it up, finding a publisher and getting it out there. And the response has just been overwhelming. This is the book. The reason I wrote it is because this is the book I've been looking for years, with all the information on each plant right there at the fingertips. And you know, it tells you everything you need to know to grow 150 different species of native plants, including maps, which, as Claudette showed on her slide, show where the plant is presumed to have been actually native to. So you don't have to guess, is this native to where I live? The map will let you know that. And the other thing that is really cool about this, it also covers the moths and butterflies that each of these plants is a host for. So there's a list of those as well, including a table at the back that lists all the butterflies that are in the book, and then gives you the list of plants that will play host to the caterpillars for those butterflies.
Yeah, and there's also detailed seed collecting and propagation information, which I think a lot of people appreciate.
Great. Thank you so much. That's excellent. And I hope looking forward to getting a copy myself, and those of you interested getting to get a copy yourselves. And so we can begin with the Q&A. It may be, if since there's three of you, it might be easier if like you raise your hand if someone make it just easier to coordinate. So the first question, what about newer breeds of natives? Are they considered non-native? So I guess cultivars.
I can take that. So cultivars are simply a variation on a theme. So we've selected certain characteristics or traits that we really like, and we breed or we take a clone if it's a sport, a one-off deal, and we sell those as cultivars in native plants. They're usually called nativars. And then those plants may or may not have characteristics that are suitable for the insects that need them. So it was mentioned earlier, I can't remember whether it was you, Vicky, or Claudette, that said, you know, the red leaves they're actually red because it's a chemical that the plant uses to keep insects from eating it. So if we have, say, Penstemon digitalis, fox-glove beard tongue, and there's a beautiful variety with red stem and leaves, but the insects won't eat it. The jury is out on most of the plants just because the research hasn't been done, but a cultivar of a native plant isn't the same thing as a native plant. It may have some values, but we're not really sure. So I always tell people, treat it as if it's not native.
Okay, thank you. Many people prefer evergreen ground covers. What native plants would you recommend for those situations? So the evergreen ground covers.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So there's a lot of different kinds of sedges that remain evergreen throughout the winter. So you have stuff like Sprengle's sedge and oak sedge. And there's also barren strawberry. It'll stay evergreen for most of the year. Foam flower. And there's also partridge berry, although that one's kind of hard to source. There's also creeping juniper. And wild strawberry will stay green for a lot of the year as well. That's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you. And the others two have something.
I could throw in, it's not it usually isn't considered a ground cover, but Capnoides sempervirens, which is usually called either rock harlequin or pale corydalis, is a beautiful little pink and yellow flower. But the sempervirens part of its Latin name means evergreen, so that stays green all year long. So if you've got a nice area that you can allow this to naturalize, then when the snow leaves early in the spring, you've got a nice green ground cover there in that area. It's not something that you would walk on. It's too delicate for that. But if you're just looking for something, say, in a corner of the garden that you aren't going to be walking on and you want greenery in the winter when the snow melts in January, that's a choice as well.
And Claudette, I think you have your, yeah.
If you want me to chime in, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that we have to get away from this idea of it's always about appearance. So yes, we always want a native plant that looks just like this invasive plant, and that, you know, like periwinkle, which doesn't, yes, in any case, that kind of thing. I think we have to get away from that, and we have to see the value in native plant gardening, and that there are other benefits to it. So we can look at, I think Sean did mention some native evergreens. So look at some low growing evergreens. That might be an alternative to it. And actually, when you plant those low growing evergreens, you create habitat for ground nesting bees, which is birds, pardon me, which is super important as well. But I think we have to sometimes just get out of that zone of, can I have a replacement for burning bush? I want that stunning color. you can get alternatives certainly in native plants, but I think we have to focus on the ecosystem function. So I guess what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thanks. And there's just a question if we can get a copy of the presentation to start adding these plants. So this webinar is being recorded, so we'll have it uploaded on our YouTube channel. So you could see the slides through that video. And there's a question here I can answer as well. Are all maples susceptible to black spot? So that's referring to that black tar spot. So I wrote a section on this in the Norway maple BMP if you're interested in reading more. But basically, the fungus that infects Norway maple is unique to Norway. It has been found on sycamore maple. It's a fungus from Europe, but there's a few other tar spot funguses that infect native maples, but they're different species. And the black tar spot that affects Norway maple can't be transferred to the native species. So I don't know if any have anything to add to that one. Otherwise, we could move on. Oh, where can you buy Dutchman's pipe? Because I think that one is a little trickier to find, right? I haven't seen it too much.
So there are various lists of native plant nurseries. I know Rick has one. I have one as well that I've done. It's on the Halton Master Gardener site. So look to those. The nursery map that I have also includes non-native nurseries. And sometimes those, while they don't predominantly have native plants, they will have some plants, some native plants in them. So look to those. It's really, I would start with that, try and find something local. And then the other thing not to be afraid of is when you go to a nursery, say to them, I'm looking for Dutchman's pipe. Can you source it? Can you find it? I think the more people we have saying, can you bring in, this particular honeysuckle, the native one, the more nurseries will change what they're doing, whether they're native plant nurseries or non-native plant nurseries. So I think that's a place to start.
Okay, great. Those are great resources. Yeah. And about reed canary grass, is there a native grass or plant that can compete with this grass? Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I know my flowering perennials quite well, but when it gets to grasses, that's where I get left behind.
And I would have to say, if you have a really horribly invasive grass or plant in general, like periwinkle or this reed grass, you usually have to get rid of it because usually the rhizomes take up the entire soil area. So you have to get rid of that and before you can add anything else to that garden. So that, to me, it would be a priority. It depends a little bit on the plant, but certainly one that just fills the soil with rhizomes, you have to get rid of those rhizomes or the invasive plant will come back.
Yeah. And I know in the past we've included reed canary in the presentation, and we would recommend the same alternatives as for miscanthus. So the canary reed, the big blue stem, and Indian grass as some examples. So another question here: how do what do you say for people who say I like it, or with respect to dumping in woodlands, it's so much work to bag and bring to the dump, so just kind of a lot of effort to do it properly, I guess.
Well, I think the alternative is the risks that are posed and the fact that if you are dumping things, it's illegal to do that, first of all. It is just wrong ethically. It harms biodiversity. It harms everyone. It harms yourself. It harms biodiversity. It's just the wrong thing to do. And yes, sometimes it's hard to do the right thing, but that's not an excuse to continue doing the wrong thing either. I think that is a very poor a poor philosophy for going forward and on anything. That's my first reaction to that. And then I think with regard to when you're dealing with invasive plants, it can be overwhelming to get rid of them. I have to say, it creates stress in people. I've seen people's mental health affected. But what I would say is do it a little bit at a time. Start with a square foot, start with a square meter, start with the invasion front. Do a little bit this year and a little bit next year. I planted invasive scilla in my garden years ago. it is spread to my entire front garden. I'm not sure that I'll ever get rid of it there, but some of my back gardens that are enclosed, I'm tackling it there. It's a lot of work, but I think it's worth the effort. I think our ecosystems and our butterflies and our bees and just, it's just worth it, is what I would say.
Yeah, that's really good advice, especially with not getting overwhelmed and kind of breaking up what you can into little chunks in terms of controlling invasives. Yeah. Is it possible to get a copy of the graphic for ecosystem relationships? I think that was in your presentation, Claudette.
Whatever was in my presentation, I'm happy to share. If we can just figure out what it is that you want, I will be happy to share that with you.
Are lilacs good? What are alternatives to lilac species?
Oh, New Jersey tea for some reason pops up. I absolutely love New Jersey tea, both because it's a pollinator plant, you know, and it's a host plant for butterflies, but it has gorgeous flowers. It's a lovely plant. It's shrubby. It's not as tall as a lilac, certainly, but I'm really enamored with it. I'm sure Sean and Rick have other ideas.
Yeah, I guess it would really depend on the specific growing conditions of the site, because it's sometimes hard to make an exact recommendation.
And I'll just pipe in here too, as Sean says, it depends on what you're looking for, what you like about that lilac. If it's something, if you like the smell of it, then you can look to something like New Jersey tea. But if you're looking for something that's got the height and say color to it, maybe you want to look at nannyberry or spice bush or something. But those things are, you know, going to bloom at a slightly different time. The flower colors are going to be different than the lilac colors. I mean, there's the reason we have so many lilacs growing all over Ontario is because, yes, they're beautiful. They have a wonderful fragrance. And many of us grew up thinking that was the perfect shrub in our backyard because of the fragrance and the beautiful flowers you could bring in. But I think, as Claudette says, what we have to start thinking about is, you know, what is this plant doing for me and what is it doing for the ecosystem? And I think that's where it's a mindset change that comes with time. Almost everybody who I've introduced native plants to in the garden, within a few years, they're on board 100% because they see the huge increase in biodiversity in the yard, all the different bees and the fireflies and everything else that were never there before. And this kind of is the switch that changes their thinking to, yeah, it's not, the lilac smells beautiful and it's beautiful, but it's not doing anything for the biodiversity, so let's get rid of it. The last thing that went out of my backyard was a massive saucer magnolia that was beautiful every year. And people said, you can't get rid of that. It's too lovely. Well, I've replaced it with a wild black cherry. And that tree is just beautiful as well. It's just beautiful in a different way. And it's got a whole lot of pollinators and birds that are much happier now.
When you're talking to people about this kind of thing, it's really good to have an analogy, and I lacked that a second ago. So we're trying to find replacements that are the same, and it would be like, I'm gaining weight. I need to stop eating, you know, so and so. So can you give me another replacement, you know, another sugary food that would be a good replacement for this? And no, that's not it. You have to change your diet. You have to change your diet of plants. That whole thing has to change for you to be healthy, for the ecosystem to be healthy. So I'm not sure if that's a good example for you, but you just have to not try to seek the same thing over and over, those same errors actually that we've been making over and over in the way we've been planting for aesthetics, planting for appearance. Mulch is a feature in the garden. Like that is a weird thing that we have done, especially red mulch. It's like a crazy thing to think that mulch is like the focal point of your garden.
Yeah, I've never understood that.
Like that, those are great points, especially sometimes it can be tricky, like lilac, you know, it's associated with some nostalgia. Like I know for me, it reminds me of like my childhood and it's, you know, but it's, you know, it's not offering anything. And then it's, again, like those are really good points about the benefits of bringing in natives instead. And supporting wildlife. So there's another question here. Is there a list of keystone species by flowering season? If possible, excluding native trees, as some gardens are too small for native trees. I guess small sites for native.
Well, I think Claudette said it, that, you know, or one of you two said it anyway. You know, the goldenrods and asters definitely are right up there for keystone species. Beyond that, I mean, take a look at our book or any of the other books like it that tell you which butterflies and moths it's a host for. Look at the Illinois wildflower site to see which plants have a large faunal association with various insects and animals. So that it will take a bit of homework, but it really depends on your site conditions and what you're looking for. There's a few things, like Doug Tallamy's work with trees says oaks are, but that's down in Delaware and Virginia and North Carolina. They may or may not be here. The research hasn't been done, so maybe there's something else here that is just as valuable to our insects as the oaks are. But part of the fun of this actually is finding out which plants look nice and have all these environmental benefits as well.
And I think you just start adding them to your garden. And I think what Rick said, like, yes, I actually think oaks are super trees to support, but not everyone has the place for an oak tree. But, you know, do some other shrub species, like, and do a variety. Try all kinds of different ones. Gray dogwood is a gorgeous plant which supports multiple species. Actually, lots of our native dogwoods do. When someone asked about lilac, I know it doesn't have exactly the same conditions, but our pagoda dogwood is a stunning plant. Our viburnum is a stunning plant. I planted viburnum, and when I first did it, I was really disappointed with it because it was totally devastated by the viburnum beetle. And then all of a sudden I started looking at it differently and going, oh, this is like now a deli for birds, because all the little caterpillars were on it. So I looked at it differently, and the plant does recover. Even though the leaves were totally eaten, the plant came back. So I just think we have to change our way of seeing, change our way of thinking, look at our gardens not as, you know, a bunch of throw cushions on the couch, but that things are functional. There's a reason why they're there, and they, you know, they support diversity, biodiversity. And just choose lots of plants. Find out what you like in your garden. That is such a cool experience. And know that not everything that you plant in your garden, whether it's native or non-native, will succeed. You know, you can have the best of intentions. You could have matched it to your garden, but it might not always be successful. So, you know, go on and find something else that works. I don't think you'll be disappointed. And everyone I know, as Rick has said, their minds are blown away by the diversity in the garden. And that's the exciting part of gardening, I think.
Right, yeah. Do you have any recommendations for planting rock gardens, species for rock gardens in and around granite?
Oh, Sean has a list.
I do. Yeah, on my website, there's a list for rock gardens.
Perfect.
There's also a list in the back of the book.
Yes.
And you mentioned mislabeled plants. Are scientific names also mislabeled, or is it just the common name that gets commonly mislabeled?
No, both. And the whole thing about common names for plants are huge. Anyone who's into gardening, you can't rely on a common name for a plant. Make sure you do look at the botanical name. But as you know, I talked about with Tiarella, botanical names change. It's not like botanists are not being fickle. They are changing the name because they've looked at the plant genetically, and they now understand that it has a different association. So there's a reason for it. So yes, they do change. I think Kew Gardens has a really good site. Kathy Cavassalis is recommending it. She told me a few the other day, and if I could remember which ones they were. Kew Gardens has a good site, and the World's Flora, POWO.ca, is an excellent site for botanical name changes. And Rick might know, and Rick and Sean might know others.
Yeah, there's I mean, my favorite story is Aster tarmacoides, which is upland white aster, and it has been for years. And just a few years ago, some observant botanists realized that just a minute, that plant is hybridizing with these goldenrods, but never with any asters. And so now the plant is Solidago tarmocoides. It's not an aster. It turned out it was a goldenrod in disguise. So that's why the scientific names changed that, and genetics now that's showing as we look more closely at the plants and find out. But what is usually consistent is the scientific name is the scientific name now. And that's the only scientific name it has. Now, there are some organizations that don't catch up quite as fast, and that, so not everybody is agreeing during that transition period, but eventually everybody say, okay, this is that plant with that scientific name. But common names, one of my favorites is marsh marigold, because my research found over 30 different common names for marsh marigold, but its scientific name is Caltha palustris. That's the only one it has. And so that's why the scientific names are so important to learn and to try to understand them. And the scientific names often will even give you hints as to where the plant is going to grow or what it's going to look like. Like palustris means from a swamp. And so you know that marsh marigold's going to live in the wet area. So lots of things like that that you can learn from the Latin.
I'm sure if Sean had anything.
No,
Okay. So the next question here is, why are there so many plants on the CBCA site, that invasive list, that are not listed anywhere else?
I can answer that a little bit, I think. Freya Witten, who works for the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, I emailed her once about this. How did you choose the plants? And I wish I can't quite find the place where she answered it. I will try, but they consulted botanical gardens, they consulted botanists, they consulted restoration ecologists. So they had a long consultation process. And it might be that Credit Valley, because they come up with a lot of resources, they might be better funded. I know the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, I'm sorry, but you guys are not funded very well. The work that you do is amazing. I don't think many people know that those best management practices, people have to request them and pay for them, if my understanding is correct, so that they are printed. So I think we're not aware of, sometimes the government doesn't do a lot of support, and conservation authorities are under threat in general. So it may depend on their individual funding, it may depend on the staff, it may depend on the knowledge base of the staff, but I know that Freya has worked really hard to get that that list out, and it is a really robust list. But we should also be looking at those invasive plant lists on border states, because we're seeing those plants are invading north. So those are really important to see. So I think it's all of those factors that are driving all the different lists. And things like Upper Thames, they would concentrate on just their conservation authority and plants that they are seeing reported invasive in their area, which is why it's so important for everyone to report invasive plants that they are seeing in natural areas on iNaturalist or EdMaps. This is how decisions are made. And it makes a difference to do that.
Right, yeah, and if I just add with the BMP, so we do have them on our website, but if you want to like print them, we no longer have the resources, unfortunately, for printing. So that's something you'd have to do yourself for the time being. And in terms of, I could maybe add a little bit with that too, like that list from CBC was adapted from a list Euphora did with Stephen Smith, and he did a very extensive research on different lists, different ones that should be on. So it was sort of based on that, and that still remains sort of the most comprehensive. The things we have, like we have probably our little small pocket book to invasive plant species is the best in terms of for like looking at what's invasive, but it's not, I guess it's not exhaustive, and there's still many horticulture invasives, and then the new ones we discover each year too.
That is a really good point. The new ones that are discovered each year, and also that goes along with that, just the fact that we're seeing buddleia now, butterfly bush. Thank you. I'm thinking butterfly bush as being showing up invasive, and people are shocked by that because they know that it does attract lots of butterflies. It does, but it doesn't support any larval species of butterfly. So while it might provide some floral resources in the way of nectar, it does not help butterflies. And the fact that it's becoming invasive now, again, there's a risk to biodiversity because you're limiting the amounts of plants that can be grown or that grow in natural areas.
Okay, great. So we're getting to 1:30, so I'll just do maybe one more question. So this is a good one for you, Claudette. Regarding the possibility of legislation banning the sale of many of the worst offenders for invasive plants, any idea if there's movement towards this action?
Well, what I can say is I have seen huge movement, and I don't know if Rick and Sean have seen this, but I've seen huge movement on our Master Gardener of Ontario Facebook page. I've seen movement on the Garden Ontario page, Facebook page, which is, I mean, Garden Ontario Hort Societies largely had, you know, historically it was non-native plants. I'm seeing them shift away from invasive plants. I'm seeing them shift towards native plants. With regard to regulation, we've talked to the CFIA a number of times. I see that Ontario has now come out and restricted Tree of Heaven, which we've asked for. So we are seeing some changes which we think are a direct impact of some of the conversations that we have had. We've just come out with our white paper has just been revised, and we will be posting it around Earth Day, we're hoping. The next step in our coalition is to go forward with a petition that we're hoping that we'll have lots of names, which is why we're looking for supporter names. We're just trying to convince the government that we have lots of support. Blue Water City Council, I think it's Blue Water, I may have the wrong name, has just passed a resolution in their municipal council against supporting us and against invasive plants. So I'm seeing all these small changes. Because we started in Ontario, we're seeing a lot of this in Ontario, but we need to really make it Canada-wide. We are seeing small advances Canada-wide, but we would just like more. So having everyone's support really helps. I don't know if that was a good enough answer, but, and then look to our SIPR website and our Facebook page for updates. We do our best to update there as much as possible. It's a lot.
Do you have any thoughts to add, Rick or Sean?
No.
No,
Okay.
other than just having seen people get excited on Facebook when they see that a particular nursery has advertised they're not going to sell these invasive plants. So there's huge support from the buying community for this as well. And I think we just need to get more non-native specialized nurseries to get on board as well, and get away from the invasives. And you know, really that's been their training. Most of these nurseries are run by horticulturalists who came up through the school that exotics were good and they're profitable. And so let's sell them. And we have to get the ground roots movement going to convince them otherwise as well.
Right, that mindset change.
Wanted to echo what Rick said. We see nurseries now on our Master Gardener Facebook page. They're watching what people are saying on our page, and they're changing what they're offering for sale based on that. And we're hoping we're going to get more nurseries on our map that say they're not selling invasive plants. But the whole trick to that is what's invasive? What list are they using? That's another conversation. It's a long conversation though.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, Claudette, Rick, and Sean, for providing all those really informative answers and presentation. It has been really exciting, inspiring to see just how the interest in native gardening. I mean, just to say this was one of the most signed up webinar we've had at OIPC. We reached our maximum from our Zoom, so it's just really great to see this interest. It's definitely grown in the last few years. So I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. There's a lot of great questions still. So maybe you reach out to me or one of the other panelists, and we can try to get to your answer in the chat. And I just wanted to encourage people to fill out. We have a post-event survey, so it's going to be in the browser window after the webinar and in an email. So check out for that. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for this great webinar, and looking forward to doing native gardening this year, and hope you learned a lot.
And if I can throw in one more shameless plug on my website, nativeplantgardener.ca, I'm just in the process of getting a calendar set up so that you can go and see where I'm going to be giving talks or having book signings or whatever over the next few weeks, because I'm on the road several days a week for the next couple of months doing that. And so hopefully by the end of today, we'll have something so you can check it out. If I'm coming nearby, then feel free to come by and say hi and ask me some questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick.
And to plug Rick further, go to his blog. Awesome advice on how to contain aggressive native plants. And thank you to Sean for keeping your information up there, even though I know you're not selling plants currently. I rely on that so much. It's super.
Of course, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Vicki.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Emily, for hosting.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.